name is David Schnese-Jacobson. I'm the preaching professor here at Boston University School of Theology. And I want to greet you, Dr. Pape, and thank you for being a part of our conversation today with the webinar. And what I think I'll do is I'd like to go around, first of all, and introduce the two students who are here with me. And after they've done that, I'll at least let you know a little bit about the students who are attending online in the chat room, because they may want to pose questions as well down the line. And then I thought, after that, if you could maybe begin talking about your book project and what you're doing. I think that'll really get us launched into a very good conversation today. So I think I'll start with the students who are here and ask Johan Go to introduce himself and talk a bit about his program and what he's been studying, just so we have a sense of what the students here are working on, and as a way of furthering the conversation with you and your research.
Hello, Dr. Pape. My name is Johan Go from Korea, and I'm in third year PhD program, and my concentration is homiletic. And now I'm taking qualifying exam and try to survive doing that in the process. And my research project is developing a contextual theological preaching for Korean context. So yeah, I'm very much interested in the contextual aspect of preaching, and yeah, that's what I try to do.
My name is Mason Lee. I am a Master of Sacred Theology student here at Boston University. My interests are homiletics, and particularly theologies of preaching and hermeneutics and context, and how those all sort of work themselves out in preaching.
Dr. Pape, I wanted to let you know about the people who are in the chat room. So there's three students in there presently. Duse Lee, who is a PhD student in homiletics and coursework at this moment. He's looking at prophetic preaching in the Korean context and what he calls interpretive communities. So he's looking at some post-structuralist aspects of looking at communities of interpretation and how that might impact the way prophetic preaching is envisioned in the Korean context. Also present online today under the name Elizabeth is Elizabeth Siwo Okundi. She is writing her dissertation right now, a wonderful dissertation on African preaching, starting with the very diverse setting of the Kenyan context with attention to what she calls the small voices, or the voices especially of women and young people who view themselves as preachers in the context of the very fascinating and fast-growing African church. The final student listed on the chat room is Sung-Young Jung, who is a PhD student also working on her dissertation. She's looking at developing a model of Korean immigrant preaching that looks closely at the Psalms as a source for thinking about what the preaching task might be like in an immigrant context. So I want to greet all three of those students who are participating online and invite them, as they feel so moved, to pose questions. I'll be trying to look at the screen so I can relay those questions and verbalize them so we can have the conversation here. As we get started, I want to first of all do the little book plug. So here is Dr. Pape's book, The Scandal of Having Something to Say, Recour and the Possibility of Post-Liberal Preaching. I really enjoyed reading this book, in part because I've been a fan of Recour for some time. My own experience in dealing with Recour has been in somewhat of a more piecemeal fashion, where there are aspects of his work in the rule of metaphor, or his understanding of emplotment, or the work that he does as well with some of the aspects of how he thinks about elements of interpretation, like in interpretation theory. These have really all played a role for me in my own research, but what I really marvel at with your work, Dr. Pape, is that you tend to view Recour in a very holistic way, seeing his whole corpus and viewing his whole corpus as being very productive for bringing into conversation with homiletics generally, and a post-liberal homiletic in particular. So I'm just really pleased to have you here today. Lance Pape is Granville and Erlen Walker, Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Bright Divinity School. And with that, I welcome you and ask you to begin your talk with us. Dr.
Great, thanks very much. Good to see you and to be introduced also to the participants online. Can you hear me well?
I can.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I wanted to start off by talking about how I got into this project. This is a project that really dates back to my time as a congregational pastor and preacher. And I was introduced to Chuck Campbell's book, Preaching Jesus, and read that book and was really struck by some of his arguments in terms of critiques of narrative homiletics. I was trained at Yale and was doing what I thought I was taught to do there in terms of preaching, narrative preaching. And Campbell's book was just a real eye-opener for me in terms of needing better reasons to do what I was doing. I felt that my preaching was biblical and effective, but I felt that some of Campbell's critiques were fairly devastating. I remember reading for the first time his idea that just because everyone loves a good story or just because stories are interesting doesn't necessarily justify a story-grounded homiletic. And his work really got me starting to think about attempting to unpack a little bit more what was happening in narrative preaching. I wanted to argue with his book, frankly, because I thought story was important in ways that I was not able to account for. So that's kind of how the project started. My application at Emory University it sort of outlined this project as what I wanted to work on. I wanted to make a sort of credible response to Preaching Jesus. And reading the book, I'm sure you see that his book was a major conversation partner. His work is something that I admire and I think is worthy of a good argument. So when I got to Emory, I found out that Tom Long had been working with Ricoeur and formulating some of his own thoughts. In fact, he was sort of in the middle of his preparation for the Beecher lecture that became the book Preaching from Memory to Hope, in which he wrestles with Ricoeur a bit. And he really encouraged me to read Ricoeur as a way of thinking through some of what I wanted to say in response to Campbell. I share a lot of Campbell's commitments, but I wanted to be able to say something about poetics. I wanted to be able to say something about story and why it was important, other than just that stories are attractive rhetorically, or that Scripture is storied. Those didn't seem like a very sound grounding theologically for some of the claims or some of the weight that I wanted to put on narrative and its role in preaching. So I remember in a narrative theory seminar, my project for that seminar was to compare the narrative theological hermeneutics of Hans Frey and Paul Ricoeur. Ricoeur is an interesting figure because his world is much larger than someone like Frey's in terms of his academic, the scope of his work. I mean, here's someone really who has addressed basically every major figure in the Western philosophical tradition, and he's done work in everything from psychoanalysis to narrative theory to philosophy of language to he's just this vast scope of his work. But I did begin to detect a pattern or a sort of underlying stream of thought in his work, and I think Ricoeur's biography is interesting in this connection because he was raised a Protestant in having. Let me just see the screen. I'd rather have this the other way. There we go. There we go. Okay. You still there?
Yeah, we're fine.
Good. Sorry. Ricoeur was raised a Protestant in predominantly Catholic France, and he was raised sort of, going to church 3 times a week, kind of the way I did, actually, as a kid, being raised in a southern, fairly conservative denomination. And I really feel like although his career, he's sort of known as a philosopher, I do think there was always this question of trying to give an account of how the Bible could be true, so in light of rather devastating critiques of modernity. I think that is a stream that is sort of you can trace through his work. And I've found that in formulating a kind of a response to the construal of the Bible that I experience in the South, that Ricoeur has kind of helped me think about the construal of the text not as what I've come to call not as accurate historical report, but rather as adequate poetic testimony. And I think each piece of that, not accurate historical report, but rather adequate poetic testimony, each piece of that is something that he's helped me with. Although in some contexts, I would say that the contrast is between inaccurate historical report and adequate poetic testimony, which is to say, if you're sort of construing the text as a historical report, in some sense intended to refer back, and to refer back in a more or less precise manner, then you could come to the conclusion that it's accurate, and that would be sort of one modern take on Scripture, or you could conclude that it's inaccurate, and that would sort of be the more suspicious mode of historical criticism toward biblical narrative. But what Ricoeur gave me were resources for thinking about the Bible in completely different terms, to think of it not as a text that refers back, but to think of it as a form of poetic discourse, right? And his notion of poetic language was very important to me. The idea that language that is discourse that is poetic has truth-bearing capacities, but that it functions in a very different way from sort of normal descriptive uses of language, and that it builds its poetic meaning sort of on the ruins of normal kinds of reference and normal kinds of sense. So that's been an important idea to me. Of course, if you make that leap to adequate poetic testimony, it's sort of, for someone like me that and for Christians that have a concern for what Ricoeur calls the Bible's historic density. I think that's an interesting term. In other words, Christianity, of course, has a stake in extra-textual reality. It has a stake in, if you want to think of it in terms of incarnational theology or simply in terms of the scandal of particularity, Christianity cares about the world behind the text. And Ricoeur's hermeneutics, of course, have to do with the world in front of the text, which is to say that texts mean by referring forward, and they mean in relation to their reception by readers, and there's a kind of, Gadamer called it a fusion of horizons. I think that's as good a term as any, in terms of sort of the agenda or itinerary of meaning of the text interacting with that of the reader. And the problem being there that if it's an exclusively textual world, then how does that relate to Christianity's claims about the importance of what happened in the so-called real world? I suppose it's okay for novels to just signify in a way that you don't have to ever address issues of what happened. They mean what they mean. But what about the fact that we claim that the Bible and that the history of the reception of the Bible very much depends on this idea of it being indebted to what precedes it, to the notion that God discloses God's self in history, and that the Bible in somehow is testimony to that. So Ricoeur's category of testimony has been extremely important for me as well. And I think a key insight for homiletics being that the reason a homiletician cares about poetics is that the Bible's testimony is a function of the world in front of the text. It's not that the Bible offers us an accurate historical report, sort of the lending of the eyes of the witness through language, and then we sort of get to go back and make our own decision about it. But I see in Ricoeur's hermeneutics of testimony this idea that testimony is already a hermeneutical act, right? It's already it's an attestation to a judgment about what has happened. And that attestation is communicated through a textual world. So the world in front of the text is the place where the Bible's testimony is made, and that's the space that we need to become competent at displaying and exploring and interacting with. Which is not to say that it's merely a textual world, because it's a poem, so to speak, a theological poem written under a debt to what precedes it. It's not a poem. The Gospel of Mark, for example, if you imagine it as a kind of theological poem about the identity of Jesus, it's not a poem written in perfect creative freedom. It's a poem written under a debt to the particular reality that precedes it. And yet to engage it is not to engage it as a series of propositions pointing back behind it, but to sort of engage its world as a total attestation to what precedes it. And therefore, to preach well would be to let the sermon recapitulate the world of that text. it would let the sermon, you can sort of imagine the text projecting a world in front of itself. Sermons also are texts. They are not inscribed, but they are wrought, right? Which is that's the true criterion of textuality. Is not that it be something inscribed, but that it be wrought, it be made. That is, language that's formed under the constraints of genre. And the sermon, therefore, has this textual quality of projecting the world. And I think the idea would be for the sermonic world to recapitulate the world encountered in the text. And so you could almost think of the preacher as someone commissioned and sent as a surrogate into the world projected in front of the biblical text to explore that space. And then to return and to preach a sermon which itself projects a world that the congregation enters, and that space should in some way recapitulate or do again, both in what it says and does, the world of the text. So that was an important idea for me, to somehow hold together both that biblical language is unlike our ordinary language, right? And that when you're reading in Genesis 1 that a wind from God blew, you know that the next sentence is not going to be, and in the afternoon the wind from God was light and variable from 10 to 15 miles per hour. It's not that kind of talk. But what do you do with it if you also understand that although it's poetic, it is still poetry written under a debt to extra-textual reality that precedes it. And so Ricoeur really has sort of helped me navigate that, so that the Bible can be understood not simply as a general myth about authentic existence, but in some sense that the Bible can be understood as testimony to God's self-disclosure in history. And then there's the issue of narrative and threefold mimesis, which was very important to my thinking about sort of how stories do what they do. I feel like with Ricoeur, there's this very powerful thing called story, and we know when we interact with it, it's a powerful experience. We know that it's transformative, that in a sense we are changed by the stories we encounter, especially those that we cooperate with, those that we read and take with absolute seriousness. But that idea of coming to understand that our experience is sort of a pre-narrated story. It sort of has all the elements of a narrative, but it's not. We're kind of searching for the plot. It's not fully formed. That would be mimesis 1. That our lives are kind of full of things that belong in a story, so to speak, characters and motives, goals, projects, all the things that sort of are the building blocks of a story, and yet they don't really quite hold together. It's a prefigured kind of story. And then seeing actual instances of constructed text stories, biblical text, for example, as sort of configured plots where those pieces have been put together in sense-making ways, and then understanding that when you read something like that, when you read a Mimesis 2, a configured plot, that your own life can be sort of reconfigured around that. And that idea of Mimesis 3, which I sort of talk about in terms of the debt to the possible, sort of a way our lives could be reimagined through our encounter in the world in front of the text, as a way of sort of thinking about what happens in a sermon when the preacher is able to point towards something that wasn't there before. It's something that the preacher encountered in her experiences in the world in front of the text, and then the sermon can be formed under a debt to that vision that so far she has seen and no one else has seen, and that she's, when she's writing her sermon, she's sort of moving in response to that new vision of what's possible that is derived from an encounter with the biblical text. So that's a lot in a little time, but those are some of the themes that continue to be important for me from Ricoeur. And I'm eager to hear from you what you're interested in or wish to perhaps argue about. I mean, I love talking about this stuff, so I'm very hopeful about conversation.
I'd like to maybe start that off just a little bit by asking a question, because it was so fascinating to me. You started off by recalling your own reading of Campbell, and that's certainly something that we wrestle with a lot here as well. And I'm wondering, in your book, you talk about some concerns about an over-reliance on kind of an ascriptive logic of identity, and how you see, I hope I'm perceiving it correctly, a more dialogical view that takes matters of experience understood as prefiguration more seriously, and conversely is open to matters of context at the level of Mimesis 3, where this interaction in the world in front of the text and the exploration of a text's own most possibilities views context as more of a productive conversation partner and not necessarily the countercultural enemy. So I'll leave what's very much my own impressionistic reading of your work, but I'd like to hear you respond to these questions I'm raising about whether your point of view in trying to reconcile Fry and Ricoeur is in a way opening up a broader conversation about a proper relationship of gospel to experience in context in ways that honors the otherness of gospel without utterly sacrificing all of that to either experience or culture or context as kind of a foil. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, that's very well put. I mean, that's exactly the sort of the fine line I'm trying to walk. Yeah, I mean, you get the idea, and I think James Kay said in a review of Preaching Jesus that it's kind of hard to understand how, if you sort of take that late Fry and spin a homiletic out of it, which I think Campbell does rather skillfully, it's kind of hard to understand why you would need a preacher and not just a lector, right? Not just sort of someone to read. That the act of preaching sort of implies that there is something new that needs to be said. That novelty is part of it. Fidelity is part of it, but so is novelty. And you want a novelty that would be faithful. You want a new thing that you can say that will in some way be recognizable still as thoroughly indebted to the text and its agenda of meaning. And yet it must be said new, not just because it has to be reapplied, but because the meaning is in fact new. I tell my students a lot that a text can mean more than one thing, but not just anything. And I think that kind of gets at the way context, at least in a Ricoeurian way of understanding it, it activates meanings that lay latent in the text. That lie latent in the text. I think it's a Catholic theologian by the name of Schillebeeckx talking about Guatemalan peasants reading the Gospels and having new memories of Jesus. I mean, that's a fascinating phrase to me. New memories of Jesus. In other words, these are authentically encounters with the identity of Jesus that emerge out of close reading of a biblical text, but they're memories that no one has had yet up to now because they were sort of lying there latent in the text, waiting for the right reader to activate them, waiting for the right context for that dimension of that identity to disclose. And I really like that phrase because it kind of gets at both directions, that this is a text that bears forward the identity of Jesus. But because that identity is borne forward in a world in front of the text, which is to say a space that's created through the poetic functions of language, that world has its own richness and thickness and integrity, and each new reader that comes into it, bearing the concerns of that reader's world and experience and context, will activate and be able to see different things in that space than other readers, maybe different things than have ever been encountered there before. And that really resonates with me theologically, with this notion of the Bible as a living word that's addressed to the present and that continues to speak. I worry a little bit about sort of one reading of Fry, that it's really kind of locking things down in ways that are not helpful and not true to our experience as readers.
I find that when we talk hermeneutics, you don't have to scratch very much and you start wandering into theology pretty quickly. And so I want to pose a question to you that I think sort of stands at the frame of your book, but I want to see if this is my own personal reading and I may be way off. Do you see yourself, in terms of what you've done, as utterly being in line with the Barthian vision of theology that assumes that after Revelation all theology is downhill? Or is there more to it than that? And to my mind, I love recours because of this idea of the surplus of meaning from interpretation theory. And I agree with you. I want to be faithful to a text, but I also understand there's an element of novelty in any theological activity that happens, if I'm reading you correctly, at the level especially of Mimesis 3. And so I'm wondering, do you see yourself as being in a sort of straight line continuity with Barth? Or do you see what you're offering as perhaps engaging in some sort of revision of a kind of Barthian theology? Because the tension I experience in reading your book is a strong desire to hold to the extra nos of the word with an openness to this interactivity between text and context. And the theological work, the way you put it, I love it, is fidelity and novelty, right? And I'm wondering if that begins to push you beyond the sort of Barthian arc at all, or at least beyond a notion that the gospel always has to be countercultural.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I definitely am pushing on that issue. I feel a strong debt. Frankly, I feel a strong debt of gratitude to Barth, who was something of a lifeline for me when the house of cards that I had built was sort of coming undone, much earlier when I was an MDiv student at Yale. But also a debt intellectually. And there's a lot in Barth that can be read this way. I love that story, probably apocryphal, about Barth lecturing on Genesis 1 through 3 and someone asking him, but Professor Barth, do you really believe that snakes can talk? And the rejoinder, it doesn't matter if snakes can talk. What matters is what the snake said. That willingness to just sort of bracket those concerns, this sort of intuitive sense that to take this text seriously means something very different than worrying about if snakes can talk. So in that spirit, I mean, I do think that recours is quite Barthian, and there's a book that I footnote in my book by a guy named Wallace, Mark Wallace, who was the editor of Figuring the Sacred, right? So that collection of recours writings on religion and God. Yeah, he has a book called The Second Naivete, and I think the subtitle is something like Recours, Barth, and the New Yale School, or something like that. And the idea being that recours can be read in a Barthian way, and and perhaps that Barth can be read in a Recourian way. And I found that pretty persuasive, that there are a lot of connections, but I will say that my thought through this project has been moving away from Barth, or some of the more extreme forms of Barthianism. Anyway, I'm not sure that Barth would have loved Barthians. But yeah, I think you're definitely right to see a sort of opening. Barth has some interesting materials. There's a piece in the Dogmatics on secular parables. This idea that there are the test of a secular parable, of course, being the word, but there are these intimations in wider experience of truths that Scripture gives us the sort of the proper way of seeing.
Well, Dr. Pape, I could go on all day, but I have some students here I know who want to get in the mix here. So what I'll do is ask any of you online, if you have questions, to go ahead and post those, and I'll relay them orally. But I'll turn to my colleagues here and ask if anyone wants to ask a question of you.
Hello, Dr. Pape. One of the questions I have concerning narrativity, it seems, at least as I read recours and as I read your book, and especially Tom Long with things he's done with recours, it seems that there's a heavy emphasis on this kind of narrative ontology about narrative being a fundamental state of what it is to be human, and being a good human is having a good narrative. I guess the question that arises for me is what is the implication of that then for those who are not able to achieve that kind of narrativity? I'm thinking particularly of the mentally handicapped, mentally disabled, or for whatever reason, people who are not able to to make the kind of connections between mimesis 1, 2, and 3 that a narrative ontology would seem to say is vital to being a Christian and a good human. And then connected with that, to me, that brings to light a question of then what is the gospel to those people who can't achieve that kind of narrativity? And so what?
Right. No. Great question. And I'm as a strident non-foundationalist, I worry about these sort of transcultural claims about a narrative as fundamental. And so you may be familiar with the work of Galen Strawson against narrativity, and his claim, of course, being that that some people just don't work that way, right? That his notion of the episodic and his own claims of being episodic. But yeah, no, I'm very sensitive to that. My oldest child has high-functioning autism, and she's in her own quirky way a brilliant person, but stories are not really her thing. I've spent a lifetime trying to make her love literature. I've read her a lot of it, and she struggles. She has this like 20-volume comic book series that she's writing where she's sort of experimenting with narrative, but it's very unintuitive for her. So I'm suspicious of sweeping claims. I think it's pretty clear that for most people in our context, story and narrative identity is very helpful descriptively. I think there's a lot of different ways to think about what it means to be human. That is one helpful one, has been for me. So I'm not so big on the sort of the prescriptive narrativity theory. It's more of a descriptive thing. Does that make sense? That I see that story is important to people. I see that Christianity has a stake in narrative. But I don't think that means that. I don't think I would say that fundamentally what it means to be human is to construe your life as a story. Because I see people that don't, or that's it's not as important for them. So these sort of total accounts of reality of what it means to be human are probably not helpful. Having said that, I guess I am something of a prescriptivist in that I think it would be very hard to mediate Christian faith to someone in non-narrative form. So it's something to keep thinking about. I'd be interested to know sort of where you've gone with that.
That's a question I have because, like you said before, I would agree with you that I think Christian faith has a stake in narrative. And I guess the concern that I'm trying to think through is my own experience registers that too, that there are some people that kind of prescriptive narrative is they don't live that way, or they're unable to for whatever reason. And so the question for me then becomes, for a faith that has a stake in narrative, what does the gospel look like to those people then in that situation?
Right. If I think of an analogy, something like is linguistic capacity fundamental to being human? There are a lot of people that don't have a capacity for language, and they ought to be treated humanely, right? But I think what is at stake maybe in that interaction is sort of our humanity in terms of, it's not really their humanity that's at stake. It's more ours and how we treat someone who, for example, was not even able to speak. But I think I could say that and at the same time say that language is the house of being. That there is something about being able to speak that is pretty fundamental to what at least I can understand as human being. And I think narrative is like that, and I think that actually the linguistic piece and the narrative piece are quite close. Recruit talks about metaphor, right, as the genesis of meaning. The subtitle of Rule of Metaphor has to do with semantic innovation, right? So this is how new meanings come about. And for Ricoeur, metaphor is sort of the basic building block of narrative. Like if you think about it, really narratives are just sort of extended metaphorical systems, and that basic poetic referential capacity of metaphor it really blooms into its full potential as an extended work. And he has something about this in the intro to Time and Narrative, that really this 3-volume Time and Narrative is the end game of the work that was begun in Rule of Metaphor. So I raised that in order to say that these pieces are all connected, and that, you know, I certainly wouldn't want to say that someone that couldn't speak is not human. That's not at all. That's not the flow of the thought. But is speaking fundamental to being human? I mean, I would want to say that as well. So,
Dr. Pape, I want to direct your attention to the chat room off on the left side of the screen. I think you have there. Duce Lee is a student who's participating online today, and he writes this question. He wonders how you define yourself. A revisionist, post-liberal homiletician? The reason he's asking this question is that he thinks Ricoeur's hermeneutics can be more broadly applied to other trajectories of homiletics, such as liberationist, contextual, or post-colonial homiletics, since the emphasis lies on the task of interpretation/understanding/transformation. Do you think they also need to be revised through Ricoeur's model? And if so, how do you revise them?
And if so,
that sounds like a whole
revise
research
them?
trajectory to me, Dr. Pape.
That sounds like a whole research trajectory. To
But
me.
it does. That's great. Yeah, great question. I mean,
I like the question that it pushes. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, for my part, I certainly don't think of Ricoeur as a post-liberal. I think Ricoeur, frankly, has bigger fish to fry than schools of theology. It's not the way, as a theologian, I like to think about it. But he's doing a lot of things. He's got he's delving in. His question is, what does it mean to be human, and to wrestle with the big questions. So I wrote this book not thinking that I would sort of like to co-opt Ricoeur as a post-liberal and say, hey, all of you that like and respect Ricoeur, you need to understand that anonymously you're post-liberal. That's very far from but and I absolutely do think of Ricoeur as offering an important resources for revising post-liberal theology. I do self-identify as post-liberal, but strongly influenced by Barth and by Fry, less so by Limbeck, and someone like Brueggemann, who I think of as post-liberal. So in terms of actually reading text, someone like Walter Brueggemann has been more important to me actually than a lot of these philosophers or theologians. But absolutely, I think that Ricoeur is poking at some of the soft edges of post-liberalism. I mean, there are some problems in post-liberal theology, and I try to name them as an inadequate account of context, an inadequate understanding of how important poetics is, and an inadequate account of how textual claims are true, or how the Christian language game is true, and not just sort of an internal a dialogue, an intramural language game, if you will. So I think Ricoeur helps me think more about post-liberalism, and I absolutely think that Ricoeur is a very useful conversation partner for some of the projects that you name, and that this is an account of a phenomenology of reading. It would be one way to say it. I don't know if Ricoeur ever uses that term, but for me that's a helpful way to kind of summarize what Ricoeur is up to in terms of textual hermeneutics. Like, what happens in consciousness when we read, and what kind of theory would account for that, especially with respect to narrative. And that, it seems to me, would be a very helpful thing to have in any sort of hermeneutical theology, sort of an account of what happens when we read. And I find that account to be compelling and seminal. It gives rise to all kinds of thoughts. about engaging the biblical text.
I know
from
one
a
of the things I
variety
found
of
most
perspectives.
fascinating was getting to the end of the book and seeing you reanalyze Brueggemann's sermon using some of your own perspectives. And I actually thought that, I agree with you, it was a much richer reading of that sermon. When I got to the end of Preaching Jesus and read that, I kind of felt like not all of the basic commitments around the displacement of experience and its mere redescription were totally being played out there, that in fact it was a much more complex reality. And so I certainly found, I found your analysis much more encompassing of the reality of that sermon. You're very careful at the end of the book not to say that you're offering a full homiletic, but it strikes me that I view what you're doing as somewhat dialogical.
But it strikes me that I view what you're doing as somewhat dialogical.
Mary Catherine Hilker
I appreciate, for example,
how Naming Grace uses this threefold mimesis in relationship to the Emmaus story, and brings out very nicely about a sort of dialogical component with how this implotment actually works. And I wonder if perhaps what you're envisioning is a kind of dialogical homiletics that accounts for and holds to the otherness of the text. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, if you were to carry this forward into a full-fledged homiletic, how you might do it. Which I guess is asking you in a way, where does this research trajectory take you as a homiletician?
I do think the otherness of the text is I do think the otherness of the text is a really important category. Actually, I think the otherness of the text is it's the thing that gets lost in. I think it's a thing that Barth had a hold on, actually, that Barthians don't so much have a hold on. And I think it's a thing that the early Fry had a hold on, but the later Fry, when it got more into the cultural linguistic mode, the text sort of becomes the church is no longer sort of under the text. It's more of that talk about the text, the Bible as the church's book. Right? It's this idea that the Bible means what we say it means because we've been reading it for a long time. And it's this kind of circular argument. And the Bible, in a sense, is co-opted, and its strangeness, the strange new world of the Bible, is no longer very strange or new, because sort of the rules for interpretation are it means what we say it means. That's a little bit of an oversimplification of cultural linguistic hermeneutics, but not too much. That it's kind of hard to see how the Bible gets any leverage to push back against received readings in that format. So I do understand myself as trying to think about theological hermeneutics in a way that secures the capacity of the text to resist. In the same way that sort of radical reader response criticism tends to undermine the text capacity to push back. I think that some of that sort of the end game of that new critical stuff in cultural linguistic sort of closed off, the text as simply being the site of the community's, almost like there's the power of the reading community, the community of interpretation, becomes so strong in that way of imagining it that the text is just sort of the site where the reading community's values are reinscribed again and again. I very much wish to secure the autonomy of the text without doing it by descending into some kind of fundamentalism about what the Bible really is. In light of our late modern understanding of that. So in terms of the trajectory or where it leads, I mean, right now I'm working on something for Baker Academic, which is essentially an MDiv level exposition of of work I've already done. I've been teaching for 5 years now, basically since this work was done, and I've thought of some ways of saying it that are more accessible. And so that's really what I'm doing. Instead of fleshing out the larger project, I'm really trying to make myself understood to a different audience. right now, and that's my project. As I do that, I try to think more about what if I were going to play this out in terms of its implications for sermonic language, and that sort of points toward theological aesthetics, I think. And so that's if I sort of imagine the longer arc, once I get out from under this Baker academic project, which is sort of an MDiv level, I imagine this book that I'm working on is sort of a complement to a primary text in an intro preaching course, if the concern in that context is to have a richer engagement with hermeneutics. So that's kind of what I'm doing. It's not really an answer. I'd love to know where it leads. I really did see that end piece as an invitation to say, look, there's some really good stuff that can be explored here in light of Recurian hermeneutics. And it has. I'm just working on sort of the text to sermon part of that, but I think it does have broad implications.
We've kind of come to the end of our hour. I want to honor the commitments of the people who are here to make this possible for us today. They have other things they need to record. But I am grateful, Dr. Pape, you've had time to be with us. Very grateful to all of you who joined with us online today. Elizabeth Doucet and Sung Young. Great to have you with us, and certainly very grateful also for Mason Lee and Johan Go, who've been joining me here in person. But thank you above all, Dr. Pape, for taking time to be with us. It was very enjoyable to have a more in-depth engagement in light of our reading of your book. And to be in conversation with you. So thanks so much for taking time to be with us, and all the best in your future work.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Great.
So long.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.